The Golden Horde, the Black Death. A sharp crack of a burning bone startles even the shaman. He whispers an incantation and withdraws a blackened iron from the fire with a great deal of caution. This is an omen. Darkness as black as pitch shall swallow the sun, bringing cold and hunger to the earth. Black death comes from the steppe that none shall escape. From a medieval legend. In the reflections of the fire, the Khan himself saw ominous shadows. Predictions of royal astrologers were no less cheerful. Wise Sufis maintained a puzzling silence. However, nothing bode ill on the face of it. It was a regular military operation. Such trivialities could hardly shatter the mighty Horde. Shrugging off these ungodly premonitions, Zhanibek ordered his military commanders to convene. This was the famous war between Zhanibek Khan, the Italians and the Genoese in the 1340s. A local conflict that changed the entire world. How did the Silk Road become the pathway to death? The illustrious epoch of the Golden Horde and the perfect storm that was its downfall. How did the trade wars of the 14th century end? It was a good business, if I may say so. Where did the fatal epidemic begin? Many argue that these events were connected to Zhanibek. What did the first infectious disease specialists look like? A doctor would put on a mask just like this one in times of plague. The transcontinental organization, Silk Road Incorporated, geopolitical intrigue, the all-conquering pandemic that overcame the world, and medieval quarantines, the Golden Horde, the Black Death. Chapter 1. Silk Road Incorporated. Saraychik is the crossroads where naval and land-based routes meet. It's a big and bustling city. One can hear any language here, be it Spanish, Italian, French, Persian. Merchants from all across the world would come here. Saraychik or Sarakando appeared on European maps. It was an enigmatic city. Disputes about its status in the Golden Horde have been going on for many decades. It is believed that rulers used to take rest here. This is where they prayed and where they buried their kin. According to the Pizzigano map in the 14th century, Saraychik was a burial ground for the Khans of the Golden Horde. According to documented sources, the great Zhanibek's final resting place was also at the Ural. According to other sources, it was the place where he was crowned, in the Gold Pavilion or Palace. Some believe that this is precisely where Jochi's Horde took its name, the Golden Horde. Most likely, this used to be a wall of a magnificent building. At least, I'd like to imagine so. Perhaps this whole story started in the smaller palace, which is what Saraychik means when translated. We'll come to this later, however. Zhanibek, Uzbek's third son, had just taken the throne of the Golden Horde. This Zhanibek was a bizarre Muslim governor. He would show respect to scientists and everyone who distinguished themselves with knowledge, virtue, and abstinence. Upon his ascension to the throne in Saraychik, he was the protector of the righteous law. Abu el-Ghazi, the genealogical tree of the Turkic people.
Хан Узбек и хан Zhanibek были не просто правителями.
Uzbek and Zhanibek Khan were not only the rulers of the Golden Horde in its prime, they were also great architects, because lots of cities appeared and urbanization began during their reign.
Приходится процесс своеобразной урбанизации, когда возникает многочисленное количество городов.
The oases of the Great Silk Road, yet built upon or improved, taking into account the latest trends in medieval architecture. It was comfortable. The streets were wide. They were not crowded. There were squares and they had fountains. A collection of archaeological finds from a single museum at Irau. Quite impressive. but a typical collection from any Golden Horde city. These are ceramic dishes, bowls and jugs of various shapes that were excavated in Saraychik during the archaeological digs. The people and the city of Saraychik blossomed during the years of the Golden Horde's prosperity. The main project on the steppe was state building. This was Silk Road Incorporated, and it was heading north. It followed a relatively interesting route to here from Otrar, through Khorezm, then Mangishlak, there Saraychik, and further to the ports of the Black Sea. It was the Silk Road that ensured the rapid development of the Horde, and, as strange as it may sound, it was the reason for its decline. But we'll come to that later. Under Zhanibek, the empire reached its maximum height, encompassing western Siberia, the region of Middle Volga, Kazakhstan, Khorezm, Crimea, the Caucasus, and some areas of ancient Rus.
Геополитический фактор здесь стоял на первом месте, потому что
The geopolitical factor was the main one, as otherwise Zhanibek wouldn't have been recognized as the ruler of the northern regions and a mighty figure who could control the Great Silk Road.
который контролировал путь, Великий Шелковый путь.
The transcontinental road is straight, comfortable, and very scenic in places. Thousands of merchants admired the Mars-like landscapes of Mangistau. Surprisingly, in the 14th century, a wagon load of trade goods from Saraychik to Khorezm took just 20 days on camels or 40 on ox-drawn carts. Thus, in caravanserais, one after another, they went to Khorezm and back. It is important to note that the steppe empire was engaged in more than just the infrastructure of roads and the collection of tribute and customs duties. The Horde made leather and furs, delivered sturgeon and black caviar, exported elite horses, and also grew wheat. For example, in the 14th century, a third of the grain consumed in Genoa was regularly grown by the Golden Horde. The fact that they traded grain is confirmed by the agreements made between the Khans and the Italians. There were huge cargoes in transit. Goods went further to the east, to China, and from China to Europe. The military aristocracy had respected trade since the days of Genghis Khan. A Chinese chronicler wrote, "Everyone, from the ruler of the Tatars to the princes and others, provide silver to merchants for circulation. These same people buy all kinds of goods and transport them for trade in distant countries." The Mongolian Empire was a commercial empire. They were interested in trade and in dealings with other neighboring countries. This was the reason why so many people wanted to partner with the Mongols. Simply put, it was a very profitable business. This was the apex of the Golden Horde, and not only of the Horde, but also its business partners, such as Genoa and Venice. All this despite the fact that they would regularly switch allegiances and turn against one another. Naturally, there was competition between them, accompanied by all kinds of intrigue. Intrigue at a political level, of course. This game of rivalry between the Italian republics had been played out since the time of his father, Uzbek Khan. Such geopolitical realignment may even have been intriguing. It was only the vague reports from the distant borders of the empire that brought a frown to the face of Zhanibek Khan. Intuition told him that something terrible was on its way. What did the facades of Genoa hide? How did the Italian merchants clash with the Horde? And who used biological weapons? Chapter 2: Plague from a Catapult. A most impressive place is hidden behind a simple facade. Palazzo Reale is a royal palace. The Genoese managed to build such magnificent palaces thanks to their trading skills. The rise of Genoa started around the 10th century. That's when the proverb, "A Genoese is therefore a proud merchant," came to be. La Superba, meaning proud, is the epithet for the city of Genoa. It is proud and yet also somewhat cautious. Being ostentatious wasn't the norm at the time. Overall, there are more than 100 splendid buildings in Genoa, but it is not immediately obvious. These palaces began to be built in the 14th century, precisely the time when Silk Road Incorporated, the medieval transcontinental corporation, was achieving its staggering profits. Only Venice could compete with Genoa in Europe at that time. Genoa advanced to the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, creating Italian colonies on its way. In the 13th century, the Crimean town of Kaffa became Genoa's main port in the Black Sea. From there, the sea-based caravans reached Venetian Tana, currently known as Azov. Then the goods were transported to the Golden Horde settlements on the Volga and Ural. There was, one might say, a delineation of the two areas of influence. The sea was dominated by the Genoese and the Venetians, whereas the Golden Horde were the rulers of the steppe. It could hardly be said that the relations between Genoa, Venice and the Golden Horde were simple. Their relations were marred by infighting, tax rises and trade embargoes. Such economic weapons were used in the Middle Ages just as regularly as military force. It wasn't personal, of course. It was strictly business. The Golden Horde wasn't particularly happy with this. Naturally, they didn't want there to be a monopoly in the hands of Italian tradesmen who often abused their power. Venetian Tana, modern Azov, a conflict which led to the imposition of an embargo, or perhaps an episode that consequently changed the whole world. Through tolerance of the devil, the enemy of the human race, there were unheard of disagreements, delusions, and endless temptations between Zhanibek Khan and his subjects, dignitaries and vassals on the one hand, and Venetian and Genoese merchants on the other. Raphael de Carazzini, concerning the union made between the Genoese on Kaffa. Simply put, a Venetian merchant and a tax collector from the steppe came into conflict, apparently because the merchant refused to pay up. The fierce dispute resulted in the death of a subject of the Golden Horde. Riots broke out, shops were looted, and the Italians fled from Tana. For roughly 5 years, there was a ban on any imports from Genoa or Venice into the Golden Horde. Italian merchants were also denied entry into the Golden Horde. Sanctions were applied. The Italians, in turn, blocked trade routes for the Horde merchants. The matter was not limited to the application of sanctions. Zhanibek took an army to the largest Italian colony. According to various accounts, the siege of Kaffa lasted from 1 to 3 years, but the fortress walls withstood the attack, and closing access to the sea altogether was impossible. The Golden Horde may have blocked the city on more than one occasion. As a result, both sides suffered, as is often the case. According to some documented sources, a biological attack was used to break the rebellious colony. These events are widely associated with Zhanibek, who, during the siege of Kaffa, used the bodies of plague victims. Suddenly, the death, as it was called, broke out in the Tatar host, and thousands were taken by the disease every day, as if arrows from heaven were striking at them and beating down their pride. At first, the Tatars were paralyzed with fear by the ravages of the disease. They then turned their vengeance on the besieged, and in the hope of transmitting the infection to their enemies, they used their engines of war to project the bodies of the dead over the walls into the city. Gabriel de Musis, History of the Disease. The same author says that the besieged managed to fight off this bio-attack by throwing the bodies into the sea. Zhanibek's army, weakened by illness, left the Crimea. Plague, however, remained. Gabriel de Mussis writes, "The air deteriorated, water wells were poisoned, the disease spread in the city so quickly that only a few residents were able to flee." Some Genoese fell ill, boarded ships and went to Genoa. This is how plague reached Europe in the 14th century. The terrifying death devastated half of Europe at the time. It is said that it was due to Zhanibek throwing the bodies into Kaffa. How did people protect themselves from the pandemic? Where did the plague come from? And how are cats involved in all of this? Chapter 3. Medieval Epidemiologists. Among the numerous shops with hand-woven web-like lace and souvenirs, this workshop draws many into its net. How does one recognize Venice without its mask? One of the most terrifying and at the same time popular images of the Middle Ages is the plague doctor, the first specialist in infectious diseases. A doctor would put on this same mask during a plague epidemic. Rosemary, mint and other herbs were put into the mask. The smell of these herbs was believed to disinfect the air. Plague reached Venice in early 1348, some 1.5 years after the events in Kaffa. One of the islands in the Republic, Lazaretto, was rebuilt into an infection zone. This is how words like lazaret and quarantine, 40 days, came about. All the incoming ships were moored off Lazaretto for 40 days, and only after a thorough checkup by the plague doctor could those who survived move on to Venice. Furthermore, bans were imposed on visits to brothels and taverns. Plague could not be stopped altogether, however. If you look at the dynamics of plague, then a pattern emerges. It first appeared in 1348 and rampaged through to 1351. Then it reappeared after 4 years, then after 3 years, and then again after 4 years. Scientists have yet to discover exactly where the epidemic began. Most, however, concur that it likely began somewhere in the Gobi Desert, at the crossroads between the modern borders of Mongolia and China. According to another version of events, plague first became active at the natural hotbed of Isikul. Plague is an infectious disease, and its source had to be found. This would be the modern approach, of course. In the Middle Ages, the tendency would have been to view it as an ominous premonition, and it should be noted that no great epidemic is complete without them. Numerous accounts of cataclysms ranging from earthquakes to bloody snakes raining from the sky preceded the Black Death. We knew from Genoese merchants what had happened in the countries of Upper Asia shortly before the epidemic. A fiery tornado appeared either from the earth or from the sky, spread to the west and, unimpeded, exterminated a significant part of this region. Some argue that the putrid substance of the global infection was born from the stench emitted by the flame. Matteo Villani, continuation of the New Chronicles on the History of Florence. These events are indeed connected. Disastrous crop failures make natural disease carriers such as rodents move closer to residential areas, while continuous malnutrition negatively affects human immunity. At that time, there had been a very severe drought lasting many years. There was nothing in Europe to fight the disease carriers, mainly rats. In the 13th century, Pope Gregory XIII issued a papal bull called Vox in Rama, ordering the extermination of cats, which were considered to be creatures of the devil. Furthermore, hygiene wasn't a forte of medieval Europeans. The Black Death easily seized densely populated cities where washing was sinful, and lice were called God's pearls and seen as a sign of sanctity. Meanwhile, in the Golden Horde, there were public bathhouses in every city. There were bathhouses outside of homes. That is to say, they stood separately from the living quarters. This is why plague didn't affect us in the same way as it affected medieval Europe. There's scant evidence about how the epidemic affected the Golden Horde cities, except the regions of the Black Sea and Volga. The fact that quarantines were imposed in the steppe may have helped contain the spread of the infection in the Horde. When someone becomes fatally ill, a spear wrapped in black felt is put up outside their home, and from that time no stranger dares to enter the area. When the patient's death throes begin, almost everyone moves away from them because none of those present at their death can join the horde of a prince or the emperor until the new moon. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine. History of the Mongols, whom we call the Tatars. Of course, it cannot be said that Zhanibek's lands were spared by the plague. Arab and Old Russian chronicles state that many Black Sea towns and villages were depopulated, and the death rate in Crimea was around 1,000 people a day. But could the biological weapons used by the Khan during the siege at Kaffa have struck such a fatal blow around the world? Some say that gravediggers were infected with plague. They used to bury the bodies of plague victims and thus spread the disease further. Or could it be that the source of infection for the Genoese and Venetian merchants were rats, for whom fortress walls posed no obstacle? This remains unknown. The only thing all researchers agree on is that the Black Death would have reaped its harvest in any case, simply by following the Silk Road. Why is it called the Great Equalizer? How did the pandemic become the engine of progress? And what kind of storm fell upon the Golden Horde? Epilogue, the Great Equalizer. Plague claimed the lives of rich and poor, kings and commoners alike. The Great Equalizer. In the 14th century, bubonic plague claimed the lives of a quarter of the world's population, more than 60 million people. Glorious Florence, the most beautiful of all Italian cities, suffered a deadly plague. Whether under the influence of heavenly will, or sent by our sins several years before it had happened in the regions of the East, and, depriving them of an innumerable number of people, it grew miserably and reached the West. Within the walls of Florence, about 100,000 people died. Before these deaths, it may not have been assumed that there were so many inhabitants in the city. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Decameron. Surprisingly, some scientists claim that the plague became the engine of progress for the hardest hit parts of Europe. Labour and knowledge became more valued, with significant progress having been made in hygiene and medicine. This challenging time had a beneficial effect on inspiration too. The Decameron is not just a bestseller for the ages, it is a cure for despair. Plague significantly changed the daily routine of the townspeople. They preferred to spend their time outside the city, that is, if they were rich enough. And just as described by Boccaccio, they drank wine and talked about art. And yet another paradox. In the territories of Eastern Europe and the Horde, mortality was lower, with fewer exceptions. But according to one version of events, it was the plague that caused the collapse of the steppe empire. The Golden Horde continued its existence, but it could never reach the same level of greatness it had previously enjoyed. It was a perfect storm, when a disaster adds to a problem, and all this in combination drastically aggravates the event. It was a plague, an epidemic. There was a lack of animal feed. Cattle were left without fodder. It was very bleak. It was a downturn. The Great Decline started shortly after the death of Zhanibek Khan. Over 21 years, there were 25 Khans on the throne of the Golden Horde. Many settlements became independent. The decline took time, of course, but none could stop the irrevocable collapse of the empire.